January 17, 1945. Guam, Pacific Theater. The transport ship groaned as it cut through dark water. Below deck, in a cargo hold converted into a holding pen, 43 Japanese soldiers sat in silence. Their uniforms were shredded, stained with mud and blood from the caves of Iwo Jima. Some had been captured weeks ago, others days. They did not speak to one another. In the Imperial Japanese Army, surrender was not merely disgrace, it was erasure. They were no longer soldiers, they were no longer sons. They had become Kyochigashin, men who had abandoned the soul of the warrior. The hold smelled of salt, rust, and human fear. The youngest among them, a conscript named Takahashi, was 19. His hands trembled as he pressed them against the cold steel floor. He had not eaten in 4 days. None of them had. The American guards had given them water, but no food. Takahashi assumed this was the beginning. He had been told what awaited prisoners of war. His sergeant had described it in explicit detail during training. Torture, humiliation, starvation. The Americans, he had been taught, were barbarians who would strip them naked, mock their emperor, and let them die slowly in cages like animals. When the ship docked at Guam, the prisoners were led onto the pier in a column. The sun was brutal. Several men collapsed. Takahashi kept his eyes on the boots of the Marine in front of him. He did not want to see the faces of his captors. He did not want to see their hatred. But when he glanced up expecting rage, he saw something else: indifference. The Americans were chewing gum. One was smoking. Another was adjusting his helmet, bored. They did not look at the prisoners with fury. They looked at them the way one might look at cargo. The column was marched inland, past rows of Quonset huts and supply depots stacked with crates taller than a man. Takahashi had never seen so much material in one place. Jeeps rolled past, their engines humming. Bulldozers carved roads out of jungle. Everywhere there was movement, noise, abundance. It was a city built in weeks. The prisoners walked in silence, their wooden sandals scraping against gravel until they reached a fenced compound surrounded by barbed wire. The gates opened. They were herded inside, and then they smelled it. It came from a long wooden building at the center of the compound. The scent was rich, overwhelming, impossible to ignore. Takahashi's stomach clenched. He had not smelled cooked meat in months. None of them had. In the caves, they had survived on handfuls of rice mixed with weevils, on stolen coconuts, on nothing. The aroma drifting from that building was something else entirely. It was thick, savory, almost obscene in its intensity. One of the older prisoners began to weep. An American officer approached. He was tall, sunburned, and carried a clipboard. He spoke through a Japanese interpreter, a Nisei soldier whose accent carried the flatness of California. The officer's words were simple: "You will be processed. You will be assigned quarters. You will be fed." Fed, the word hung in the air. Several prisoners exchanged glances. Takahashi felt his pulse quicken. He thought of the stories. He thought of his sergeant's warnings. Perhaps the food was poisoned. Perhaps it was a test. Perhaps they would be forced to eat something humiliating: rats, insects, waste, while the Americans laughed. He braced himself. They were led into the mess hall. What Takahashi saw inside that building would fracture every assumption he had carried into captivity. The Japanese soldiers' understanding of war had been shaped by decades of ideology, deprivation, and a cultural framework that treated suffering as virtue. To understand what these prisoners expected, one must first understand what they had been taught to believe about themselves, their enemies, and the nature of struggle itself. Since the Meiji Restoration, the Japanese military had cultivated an ethos of sacrifice that bordered on the religious. The Senjinkan, the military field code issued in 1941, explicitly forbade surrender. "Do not live in shame as a prisoner," it commanded. "Die and leave no ignominious crime behind." This was not metaphor, it was doctrine. Soldiers were told that capture meant betrayal, not just of the emperor but of their ancestors, their families, their very existence. To be taken alive was to become Horyo, a word that carried the weight of eternal dishonor. This ideology was reinforced by material reality. The Imperial Japanese Army did not prioritize logistics. Supply lines were secondary to spirit. Soldiers were expected to endure hunger, to fight on empty stomachs, to sustain themselves through willpower. On Guadalcanal, Japanese forces had been reduced to eating tree bark and leather. On New Guinea, entire battalions had starved to death in the jungle. The concept of regular, abundant meals was alien. Food was not a right. It was a luxury, distributed unevenly, often withheld as punishment or lost to incompetence. And so, when Japanese soldiers were taught about the Americans, they were told that the enemy was soft, decadent, obsessed with comfort. But they were also told that Americans were cruel. Propaganda films showed U.S. Marines desecrating bodies, torturing prisoners, laughing as Japanese soldiers died. Tokyo Rose broadcast stories of POWs forced to dig their own graves. The message was clear: if you are captured, you will suffer. You will be degraded. You will wish for death. Takahashi believed this. They all did. When the prisoners entered the Guam mess hall, they expected a room of mockery. They expected chains, cages, perhaps a single bowl of rotten rice to be shared among them. They expected the Americans to remind them with every gesture that they were less than human. Instead, they saw tables. Long wooden tables set with metal trays. Each tray had compartments. At the far end of the hall, behind a serving line, American cooks stood with ladles and spatulas. Steam rose from enormous pots. The interpreter gestured toward the line. "Take a tray," he said. "Get in line." The prisoners hesitated. One of them, an older corporal named Sato, stepped forward first. His hands shook as he picked up a tray. He moved down the line. The first cook, a broad-shouldered man with a cigarette tucked behind his ear, scooped a mound of mashed potatoes onto the tray. The second added a thick slice of roast beef, glistening with fat. The third spooned green beans beside it. The fourth placed a piece of white bread, soft and pale, next to a pat of butter. Sato stared at the tray. He did not move. The cook waved him forward. "Next," he said. Takahashi was fifth in line. When his turn came, he held the tray with both hands, terrified he would drop it. The beef was still hot. The potatoes were smooth, flecked with pepper. There was a small cup of fruit cocktail, the syrup catching the light. He carried the tray to a table and sat. Around him, the other prisoners did the same. No one ate. They looked at the food, then at each other, then at the guard standing by the door. Sato finally lifted his fork. He cut a piece of beef. He put it in his mouth. His eyes closed. The meat was tender, salted, cooked in a way he had not tasted since before the war. The potatoes were creamy, rich with butter. The bread was soft enough to tear with his fingers. He chewed slowly, and then he began to cry. Not quietly. Great, shuddering sobs that shook his shoulders. He covered his face with one hand and wept into his food. One by one, the others began to eat. Some cried. Some ate in silence, methodically, as though afraid the meal would vanish. Takahashi tasted the fruit cocktail, sweet, cold, impossibly bright. He had not eaten sugar in so long that the sensation was almost painful. He ate everything on his tray. And when he was finished, he realized something that made his chest ache. He was still hungry. But more than that, he was confused. This was not torture. This was not humiliation. This was food, real food. The kind of meal he imagined American soldiers ate, but he had never imagined it would be given to him. An American guard approached the table. Takahashi flinched. The guard pointed to his empty tray, then to the serving line. "You want more?" he asked through the interpreter. Takahashi did not understand. "More." "You can go back," the interpreter said. "It's allowed." Sato stood. He walked back to the line. The cook refilled his tray without comment, without ceremony. Just another scoop of potatoes, another slice of beef. Sato returned to the table and ate again. Takahashi's hands trembled. He thought of his sergeant, who had told him that the Americans would starve him. He thought of the propaganda posters in Osaka showing U.S. soldiers as monsters. He thought of his mother who had wept when he left for the front, certain she would never see him again. He stood. He walked back to the line. This was not an accident. It was not kindness. It was policy. The United States military had learned, through painful trial and error, that the treatment of prisoners of war was not merely a moral question. It was a strategic one. The lessons had been learned in Europe first, where German POWs captured in North Africa and Italy were processed through camps in the American South and Midwest. Reports from intelligence officers noted that well-fed, well-treated prisoners were more cooperative. They provided better intelligence. They were less likely to attempt escape, and crucially, they undermined enemy propaganda. But the Pacific Theater presented a different challenge. Japanese soldiers did not surrender easily. When they did, they often expected death. Early in the war, many attempted suicide rather than face capture. American forces found themselves managing prisoners who were traumatized, malnourished, and conditioned to believe that their captors were subhuman. Traditional interrogation methods failed. Torture, threats, deprivation, these only reinforced what the prisoners had been taught. So the U.S. military tried something else. In 1943, the War Department issued guidelines for the treatment of Japanese POWs. The directives were explicit. Prisoners were to be fed the same rations as American soldiers. They were to receive medical care. They were to be housed in sanitary conditions. The reasoning was documented in internal memos. Degradation would produce silence. Dignity might produce cooperation. But there was another calculation at work, one that understood the ideological dimension of the war. If Japanese soldiers could be shown that their government had lied to them, that the Americans were not barbarians, that surrender did not mean death, then perhaps others would surrender. Perhaps the fanatic resistance on islands like Iwo Jima and Okinawa could be softened. The policy was implemented across the Pacific. On Guam, Saipan, Tinian, and dozens of smaller islands, POW camps were constructed with mess halls, barracks, and medical facilities. The food served was not symbolic. It was standard U.S. military ration: meatloaf, fried chicken, pork chops, canned vegetables, bread, butter, milk, coffee, and dessert. It was the same food that American GIs ate, shipped across thousands of miles of ocean in refrigerated holds, part of the vast logistical machinery that defined the American war effort. And it was, by Japanese standards, unimaginable. The average Japanese soldier in the Pacific consumed roughly 1,500 calories per day, often less. His diet consisted primarily of rice, supplemented occasionally by fish, vegetables, or stolen supplies. Meat was rare. Dairy was non-existent. Sugar was a memory. By contrast, the standard U.S. military ration provided 4,000 to 4,500 calories per day. American soldiers complained about the monotony of the food, about the canned Spam and the powdered eggs. But to a starving Japanese prisoner, that same meal was a revelation. The records from Guam document this. In February 1945, a U.S. Army psychologist named Captain Howard Mann conducted interviews with Japanese POWs at the camp. His reports, now archived in the National Archives, contain dozens of testimonies. One prisoner, a former sergeant named Yamada, told Mann, "I thought I would be tortured. I thought I would be killed slowly. When they gave me food, I thought it was poison. I ate it because I wanted to die quickly. When I did not die, I did not understand." Another prisoner, a naval officer named Nakamura, said, "We were told that Americans lived like kings, but that they treated their enemies like animals. I saw the food and thought, if this is how they treat animals, what do their kings eat?" Mann noted a recurring theme in his interviews. The prisoners were not merely surprised by the food. They were destabilized by it. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Everything they had been taught about the enemy was contradicted by a plate of roast beef. And because the contradiction was so visceral, so undeniable it could not be ignored. Takahashi spent his first week at the Guam camp in a state of disbelief. Every morning, the prisoners were marched to the mess hall. Every morning they were fed pancakes, scrambled eggs, bacon, and toast. Every evening they were fed meat, potatoes, vegetables, and bread. The portions were generous. Seconds were allowed. No one mocked them. No one spat in their food. The American guards were not friendly, but they were not cruel. They treated the prisoners with the same tired professionalism they used for every other task, checking rosters, distributing supplies, maintaining order. Takahashi gained weight. They all did. Within 2 weeks, the hollows in his cheeks began to fill. His ribs, which had been visible through his skin, disappeared beneath a layer of flesh. He could feel his strength returning. At night, lying on a cot in the barracks, he would think about the meals. Not with gratitude, not yet, but with confusion. Why would the American... The answer, he would later understand, was not simple generosity. It was demonstration. Every meal was a message. It said, "We have so much that we can afford to give it to you." It said, "Your empire is starving, but we are not." It said, everything you were told was a lie. The American war machine was not just a collection of ships, planes, and tanks. It was a system of production so vast, so efficient, that it could feed millions of soldiers on multiple continents, transport fresh meat across oceans, and still have enough left over to feed its enemies. The Japanese military had told its soldiers that the Americans were weak, that they lacked the spirit to endure hardship. But what Takahashi saw at Guam was not weakness. It was power. The kind of power that did not need to starve its prisoners to assert dominance. The kind of power that could afford to be humane because it was already winning. There was a term for this, though Takahashi would not learn it until much later. The Americans called it soft power. The Japanese called it shikata ganai. It cannot be helped. The reality was undeniable. One day, a new group of prisoners arrived. They had been captured on Iwo Jima, pulled from a network of tunnels where they had held out for weeks after the island fell. They were skeletal, wild-eyed, covered in sores. When they were brought to the mess hall, they reacted the way Takahashi had: disbelief, suspicion, fear. One of them, a young private, refused to eat. He sat at the table, staring at his tray, shaking his head. The interpreter tried to coax him. The guards ignored him. Finally, Sato, the older corporal, sat down beside him. "Eat," Sato said quietly. "It's poison," the private whispered. "No," Sato said, "it's not." "Then it's a trick." Sato picked up the private's fork. He cut a piece of beef and ate it. "See," he said, "it's food, just food." The private stared at him. "Why?" Sato did not have an answer. He only had the evidence in front of him. 3 meals a day, every day, without fail. The private began to cry. Then he began to eat. The symbolic weight of food in the Pacific War cannot be overstated. It was not merely sustenance. It was ideology made tangible. The Japanese soldier's willingness to endure hunger was proof of his spiritual superiority. The American soldier's abundance was proof of his material strength. And when those two systems collided in a POW camp, the result was not compromise. It was conversion. This was most evident in the prisoners' relationship with bread. In Japan, rice was sacred. It was the foundation of every meal, the measure of prosperity, the symbol of life itself. Bread, by contrast, was foreign, Western, associated with colonialism and decadence. Most Japanese soldiers had eaten bread only rarely, if at all. It was not part of their culinary identity. But in the Guam camp, bread was everywhere. White bread, soft and pillowy, served at every meal. The prisoners were fascinated by it. They would hold a slice in their hands, marveling at its texture, its lightness. Some of them saved pieces of bread in their pockets, hoarding it the way they had once hoarded rice. Others ate it slowly, savoring every bite. Takahashi became obsessed with the butter. He had never tasted butter before the war. In Japan, dairy was rare, expensive, considered somewhat unpleasant by traditional palates. But the Americans served butter at every meal, small pats of it, yellow and soft, melting into the bread. Takahashi would spread it carefully, watching it soak into the white surface, and then he would eat the bread in small bites, making it last as long as possible. One day, he asked the interpreter about it. "Why do you have so much butter?" The interpreter, a young Nisei named Tanaka, laughed. "It's just butter," he said. "We make a lot of it." "A lot?" "Yeah, farms all over. Wisconsin, California, millions of cows." Takahashi tried to imagine millions of cows. He couldn't. In Japan, meat was scarce. Cows were expensive, kept for labor, not food. The idea of entire states dedicated to producing milk and butter seemed absurd, wasteful, impossible. But the butter was real. He could taste it. By the spring of 1945, the Guam camp housed over 2,000 Japanese POWs. They had developed routines, hierarchies, a fragile sense of order. Some of them worked in camp kitchens, assisting the American cooks. Others repaired equipment, cleaned barracks, tended gardens. They were not forced to labor, but many chose to. Idleness was unbearable. Work gave them purpose, even in captivity. Takahashi was assigned to the kitchen. It was there, in the heat and noise of industrial food preparation, that he fully grasped the scale of American logistics. The kitchen on Guam was not a small operation. It was a factory. Enormous steel pots bubbled on gas stoves. Whole sides of beef hung in refrigerated lockers. Sacks of flour, sugar, and rice were stacked floor to ceiling. The cooks worked in shifts, preparing meals for thousands of men, American soldiers, POWs, laborers. The waste alone was staggering. Takahashi watched as cooks scraped half-full trays into garbage bins, food that would have fed a Japanese platoon for days discarded without thought. One afternoon, an American cook named Daniels showed Takahashi how to make mashed potatoes. Daniels was a farm boy from Iowa, stocky and cheerful, unbothered by the heat. He spoke no Japanese, but he communicated. Daniels noticed him staring. He grinned and handed Takahashi the masher. "Your turn," he said. Takahashi hesitated. Then he took the tool and began to mash. The potatoes were smooth, creamy, rich. Daniels nodded approvingly. "Good," he said. "Real good." It was such a small moment. But for Takahashi, it was transformative. He was standing in an American kitchen, preparing American food, alongside an American soldier who treated him not as a prisoner, not as an enemy, but as a person who could learn to mash potatoes. That night, lying in his bunk, Takahashi thought about his sergeant. He thought about the stories of torture and starvation. He thought about the propaganda films. And he realized with a clarity that was almost painful that he had been lied to. Not just lied to, betrayed. His government had sent him to die for an empire that could not feed him, while telling him that the enemy was barbaric. But the enemy had given him 3 meals a day. The enemy had taught him to make mashed potatoes. He did not know what to do with this knowledge. He only knew that it changed him. The transformation was not unique to Takahashi. Across the Pacific, in camps from Guam to Hawaii to the continental United States, Japanese POWs underwent similar psychological shifts. The process was documented by military psychologists, intelligence officers, and the prisoners themselves in letters and diaries that would surface decades later. One of the most detailed accounts comes from a prisoner named Lieutenant Hiroshi Funisaka, who was captured on Okinawa and sent to a camp in California. Funisaka kept a secret journal, written on scraps of paper hidden in his mattress. In it he described his first meal in American captivity: fried chicken, mashed potatoes, corn, biscuits, and apple pie. "I wept," he wrote, "not from gratitude but from shame. I thought of my men who died in the caves eating grass. I thought of my parents who had not seen meat in years. And I thought, why are we starving when they have so much?" Funisaka's question was rhetorical, but it pointed to a deeper truth. The disparity in resources between Japan and the United States was not accidental, it was structural. Japan was an island nation with limited agriculture, dependent on imports, stretched thin by years of war. The United States was a continental power with vast farmland, industrial capacity, and a population that had not experienced invasion. The Japanese military had gambled that superior spirit could overcome material disadvantage. The bet had failed, and nowhere was that failure more visible than in a POW mess hall. By the summer of 1945, the war was nearing its end. The camps on Guam and Saipan had become strange liminal spaces, neither prison nor home, populated by men who had ceased to be soldiers but had not yet become civilians. The prisoners listened to rumors. Germany had surrendered. Tokyo had been firebombed. An invasion of the home islands was imminent. Takahashi no longer thought about escape. He no longer fantasized about redemption in battle. He thought about food. He thought about the kitchen. He thought about going home and trying to explain to his mother what he had seen. In August, the news arrived. 2 cities had been destroyed by a new kind of bomb. Days later, the emperor's voice crackled over a radio announcing surrender. The war was over. The prisoners gathered in the mess hall. No one spoke. The interpreter read the emperor's statement aloud. It was formal, archaic, filled with euphemisms. The emperor did not say surrender. He said the war had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. He urged his subjects to endure the unendurable. Sato laughed bitterly. "Endure the unendurable," he muttered. "We've been doing that for years." That night the American cook served steak. It was not a celebration. It was simply what was on the menu, but the timing felt surreal. The prisoners ate in silence, chewing meat that melted on their tongues, while outside, the war that had consumed their youth, their innocence, their comrades, finally ended. Takahashi finished his steak. He set down his fork. He looked at the empty plate and thought, "This is what defeat tastes like." It tasted like butter. The prisoners remained in the camps for months after the surrender, waiting for transportation back to Japan. During that time, they were allowed to write letters home. Many struggled to find words. How could they explain what they had experienced? How could they describe the abundance, the strange mercy, the meals that had unmade their understanding of the enemy? Takahashi wrote to his mother. He told her he was alive. He told her he was healthy. He did not tell her about the food. He did not know how. In late 1945, the prisoners were finally loaded onto ships and sent home. Takahashi stood on the deck as the transport left Guam, watching the island shrink into the distance. He thought about the kitchen. He thought about Daniels, the cook from Iowa, who had shown him how to make mashed potatoes. He wondered if he would ever taste butter again. When the ship arrived in Japan, Takahashi barely recognized his homeland. The cities were ruins. The people were skeletal, hollow-eyed, moving through the rubble like ghosts. Food was scarce, more scarce than it had been during the war. The rice ration was a handful per day. There was no meat, no butter, no bread. Takahashi stood in line at a distribution center, waiting for his ration. The woman in front of him fainted from hunger. No one helped her. They just stepped around her body and kept moving. That night, Takahashi sat in the remains of his family's home and wept. Not for himself, but for the realization that everything he had been taught was backwards. He had been told that Japan was superior, that the Americans were weak. But Japan was starving, and the Americans had fed their prisoners steak. He thought about the butter. He thought about the waste he had seen in the Guam kitchen, the half-eaten trays, the discarded bread. He thought about the industrial scale of American abundance, the casual excess, the logistical miracle that could transport fresh beef across an ocean just to feed enemy soldiers. And he understood, finally, why Japan had lost. It was not spirit. It was not courage. It was butter. In the decades that followed, the stories of Japanese POWs in American camps became a quiet footnote in the history of the Pacific War. The prisoners themselves rarely spoke of their experiences. Shame lingered. Surrender, even in defeat, was a stain, but the memories persisted. In the 1970s, a Japanese journalist named Kazuo Tamiyama began interviewing former POWs for a book. He found them scattered across Japan, old men now with grandchildren living quiet lives. Many were reluctant to talk, but when they did, they returned again and again to the same subject, the food. One man, a former private named Ito, told Tamiyama, "I dream about it sometimes. The bread, the butter. I wake up and I can still taste it." Another, a former corporal named Fujita, said, "I never told my wife. How could I? I was captured. I was dishonored. But I was fed better in that camp than I had been fed in my entire life." Tamiyama's book, Hidden Horrors, was published in Japan in 1983. It was controversial, not because of what it revealed about American cruelty, but because of what it revealed about American generosity. For many Japanese readers, the idea that POWs had been well treated was difficult to accept. It complicated the narrative of victimhood, of suffering, of the atomic bombs and the firebombing. It forced a reckoning with the question, if the enemy fed us and our empire starved us, who was the villain? The butter remained. Not the literal butter that was consumed, digested, forgotten, but the idea of it, the symbol, the proof that abundance could be weaponized, that mercy could be a form of power, that a meal could shatter an ideology. Takahashi lived until 1998. He became a school teacher, married, raised 2 children. He never spoke publicly about his time as a POW, but in his final years, suffering from dementia, he would sometimes wake in the night and ask his daughter to bring him bread and butter. She would spread it carefully the way he liked, and he would eat it slowly, tears running down his weathered face. "Why are you crying, father?" she would ask. He never answered. He only ate the bread, tasting something she could not understand, a memory of defeat, of revelation, of the moment when everything he believed was undone by a pat of yellow butter melting into soft white bread. The lesson of the Japanese POWs and the American kitchens is not a simple one. It is not a story of good versus evil, of civilization versus barbarism. It is a story about systems, about the material reality of war, about the way ideology crumbles when confronted with undeniable evidence. The Japanese soldier was taught that suffering was noble, that hunger proved devotion, that the Americans were monsters. The American system did not argue with this ideology. It did not debate it. It simply served 3 meals a day, every day, without comment, without cruelty, until the ideology collapsed under the weight of roast beef and mashed potatoes. This was not kindness. It was strategy, but it was effective. By the end of the war, Japanese resistance had softened not because of bombs or bullets, but because the myth of American barbarism had been exposed as a lie. Prisoners returned home and told their families.